All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Friday lecture. If you're here, please turn on your cameras. All right. So going to. Okay. So we don't have unfortunately, we don't have a long lecture today. Just going to talk about because we talked about survey research, we talked about how you formulate the questions and the structure of the questions and all of that. Something that is still missing, and it's much simpler than the other issues we discussed, is that how survey data is collected, right? And so that's what we mean like by the sources. And so basically, we learned a lot about like sampling and then structuring the question, but who would then do the answering, right? Who would fill those surveys? And when you think about survey data, think about the source or what they're coming from. And so that would then affect what's the quality or to what extent you could trust the data you're reading. And we will talk more about that when we get into validity and reliability. We'll discuss it further on Friday. But basically on survey research, like you have four main ways of collecting data. So the first one is observed behavior. That is to say, and it's just from the name, right? You observe people and just you report their behavior. So you observe as a researcher. So the one who is filling the survey question is actually the researcher themselves, him, her, or themselves, right? Then what we have self-report. Also, I think it's understood from the title itself. Self-report, I ask you questions as participants, and then you fill your answers, like how willing are you to take the COVID-19 vaccine? Or how excited are you about the summer vacation? Or about the decisions to open up by San Diego County? So I'm asking the participant to report about themselves. Then we have something that is the other perceived assessment. So as I ask someone to rate a third person. So it's not the researcher, it's not the participant directly, but the participant reporting on someone else. So it could be like a character they see, or it could be about like an interpersonal interaction. So I could ask people to rate, for example, the person they have dated online, right? You could show different dating profiles to people and then ask about their perceptions or about their dating experience, for instance, right? So I'm not getting information from that person directly. I'm getting information from people who've interacted with that person, right? There's also a fourth category, and this is more recent in terms of when it was developed. And we're not going to discuss it in details in this class, because it's way advanced, in which you aim to capture data from the participants directly. One of them is like, one way of doing it was like the implicit test, right? They're different implicit tests. Like the famous one, there's the implicit bias test, which is what has been discussed a lot on like in the popular media and blogs and all of that. In which you would be tasked with something, and by that they would assess like your level of internalized bias, something. There are a lot of these, by the way. So there are many cognitive tests. So I ask you to solve some equations, right? And that would directly, for instance, measure your level of like speed of reaction, right? Or the ability to solve problems. So you're not asking is directly about something, but that underlying performance would tell you about the things you're trying to measure. Also, more directly, we have psychophysical measurements and neurocognitive measurements. So psychophysical measurements, by the way, so I invite you, and I have conducted this type of research before. So we'll make you watch like a clip from a horror movie. And instead of asking you later how terrified you are or you were while watching, we would actually track like your heart rate beats, so like things like skin conductance, that is to say, like how like the amount of sweat that comes up, like the movement of like those muscles right here you see. So if people are concentrating, you can track how these muscles or the T and the top move. Eye tracking, for instance, which like to which part of the screen you were looking. And there are many other things, right? This is becoming, by the way, more popular in media research. And it's a way to basically bypass the biases you get from self-reports that we talked about last time. Also, neurocognitive measurements is becoming more and more used in communication science research, especially in advertising. So for instance, I can make one group of people, so you'll get into an fMRI, you know, the device, the fMRI, you get in, so they could scan your brain. And one group of people, I can make them watch ads, commercials for fancy cars. And other group of people would watch commercials for not so fancy cars, or like economic. And then we could see what part of your brain stimulate. So the group A versus group B. Or like even same person, like you show them like different pictures, and then you just track what lights up basically in your brain. So that's a way to directly measure things like excitement or changes in attitude or like sadness and happiness. And those are very like very advanced things. So as I said, I'll just like you to be aware that they exist, but we're not going to discuss them in detail in this class. Anyhow, speaking of like observed behavior. So yeah, as I said, you want to study, so you would use observed behavior if you want to study the actual behavior of individuals as affected by some other factors, right? So if your outcome is behavior, right? So you're not asking about something like the attitude, something like that. You want to see actual behavior, so some actions, some changes that you could observe that someone. Observed behavior is it's a preferred method collecting data. I'll give you an example. So let's say you're studying the effects of video games, excessive use on violent behavior among adolescents. So assuming you have the technology and you have the IRB, pass the IRB, and you have you consider all the ethical considerations, blah, blah, blah. And so you are able to track the number of hours adolescents spend on playing video games or violent video games. So you could just record that by some mean. And then you can track like the number of violent incidents the observed adolescents engage in, whether it's in school. So do they show more aggressive behavior in the classroom or like the playground or even inside their households, right? Again, like how are you going to leave the technical part aside, but assuming you have the means to measure that. Here, you're actually looking at observed behavior. You're not asking participants to report how many video games they play. You actually have that. And you're not asking them if they've been in trouble before, because you're actually just tracking that, right? And so I think you could see like why would this be useful, right? Let me give you another example. So you could do it even in an experimental research or in a controlled lab. So you ask participants to play violent video games, and then you would subsequently observe their behavior, right? So that's that type of research, right? So you would see, for instance, if they show more aggressiveness when they talk to people. So it doesn't have to be like aggressive behavior, like physical, but it could be also like verbal or like some irritation that you could detect on those people if you observe, right? Um, and I think this is becoming more apparent, but to ask you, so assuming you're doing this type of research, right? So the effects of video games and such, would you prefer to observe participants yourself, to have the ability to observe participants' behavior, or would you just rely on self-reports? What would be more preferable to you, just as a researcher? Yes, Emily.
I feel like actually observing them would be preferable because you participants might be less likely to self-report on increased violent behavior themselves.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. So for researchers who are interested into actual behavior, so did that increase or decrease, or is there an association between that type of behavior and those outcomes? Yeah, you would like just to see for yourself. And you can think beyond this example. So many people in communication research do effects. We study social media effects, right? And we already discussed like how hard it is to report how many hours you spend on social media, right? Like how many times you check your app, your TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram. And so if we have the ability to actually look at people's data, just the number of hours, regardless of the content, well, even if we know the content, that's even better for research purposes. And so, yeah, we can then track real changes. The responses would be more valid, right? It would be more accurate because we discussed last time. So people misremember things, people misrepresent things, people don't know things, right? And there's like the how to put it, like social desirability bias and all of that. And so, ideally speaking, especially if it's something about behavior, yeah, you would like to look into like actual behavioral data. However, for logistical reasons, most surveys and experimental research rely on self-reports questionnaire because you can think of like the technical obstacles if you want to actually capture people's data, aside from the ethical consideration and the privacy and all of that. So we don't have the mean just to observe people while they watch TV or play on their mobile phones. So self-report, I mean, it's sort of like self-explanatory, but the participant just report their attitude about their behavior, about their level of knowledge, etc. They could be like multiple choice questions, they could be close-ended questions, they could be open-ended questions. Sometimes they can answer like on numerical scales. So on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, tell me blah, 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 right? Uh, and so in self-reports, whatever people report about themselves is taking at face value, right? And what I mean by that is whatever scores the participant give to themselves will be considered the measurement for the intended variable we're studying. The level of, let's say, satisfaction with school, or the level of willingness to take the vaccine. Whatever score you put into that question will be taken as the real reflection of what your intention going to be, right? So it's, what I'm trying to say, it would be more susceptible to the things we discussed last time, right? Like about people's shortcomings and biases in the answer. Let me give you an example, and then you would see how can we actually get more accurate self-report questions. So this is an experiment by actually Ann and Stern. So Stern is in Dr. Susanna Stern, who's faculty in our department. So they had a research on like the effect of advert games. So advert games are like, it's like a type of a game that is mostly produced by a company. And so you have promotional materials embedded within the game, right? So the game they studied as a case study was like Be a Pop Star, and it was designed by Post, the cereal company, specifically for Honeycomb. I think most of you are aware of Honeycomb, right? And so the game made the logo and of Honeycomb and the themes of Honeycomb visible across the game, right? And so the idea is like to get people more attached to the cereal. So the researcher actually had an interesting hypothesis, which is saying what would be the effect on people who play that game without ad breaks. So you would play the game uninterrupted, or you would play a game with in-app games, in-game ads, right? So you'd be interrupted by ads while you're playing. And the researcher was saying, or hypothesized that people who would play without an ad break are actually going to be more likely to recall the advertised brand, right? So recall means to remember, and more likely to prefer the advertised brand, right? So the memory would improve and their favorability towards the brand would increase if they played the game without the break. That's an interesting hypothesis, but we're not interested in the hypothesis for the sake of this course. We're interested into how they measured those things. And this is the most important things in terms of like the method. So the first question was about brand recall. So look carefully at the wording here. Do you remember seeing any cereal brand name while you're playing the game? If yes, list the cereal brand name here. Brand names here, okay? That's brand recall. Then they ask about brand preference. If someone offered you a bowl of cereal to eat right now, which type of cereal would you choose? So they have 4 options: Cinnamon Toast Crunch, Honeycomb, Honey Nut Cheerios, and Captain Crunch. My question to you is, knowing what we know already from last lecture, why do you think the first question was open-ended? Okay. As opposed to why was the second question close-ended with multiple choice? How would that structuring of the question affect the responses you will get from the participants? Any guesses? If you ask the question in a different way, so think about the first question about brand recall. Why didn't they ask a multiple choice question here and give different options? Why did they make it just an open-ended question without providing the options? Yes, Eric, go ahead.
I think because if it was a multiple choice question, that could sort of influence people's actual recall. Like if they see honeycomb as an option, like, oh yeah, I saw honeycomb. Whereas if it's open-ended, you're actually testing whether they remember it or not.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So remember, yeah, people cheat. And so, yeah, if it's just recall, you want to measure unaided recall, right? So without giving the participant any hint, you just assess if they do remember it or not. So if they actually observed and processed the information, they should be able to say honeycomb, right? Okay, that covers the first part. The second part, why then they had a multiple choice question for the second part. So they wanted to measure brand preference. Why did they provide 4 options as opposed to just asking about honeycomb? Any ideas?
Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, sure. So the second question, why didn't they choose to give the participants 4 options to choose from, as opposed to just asking about the product they're researching, which is honeycomb, right? So they could have asked, do you prefer honeycomb or not? Why, or what's the value of asking this question and providing 4 options to choose from?
I think that because it sort of measures whether playing the game actually led to any increased preference, like even among competitors, just like it would be in like a grocery store, for example.
So you're saying what they would be measured here is preference among other options, right?
Yes.
So that's what would they be measured? Okay, yeah. So that's a good one. So if preference did improve, you should see higher likelihood for people picking honeycomb among other options. But then why didn't they just ask, if you were, would you like to be offered a ball of honeycomb right now? What would be the issue with that? I'm trying to say which approach is better, just to ask that or to give 4 options. And it's sort of related to what Eric said earlier. He gets this. Yes, Eric, go ahead. Give it a try.
If you ask someone, if you're just offering them like a bowl of honeycomb, you're not actually testing preference because there's not any alternatives. It's would you like a bowl of cereal or not? Whereas when the 4 questions, you're actually testing preference against competitors.
Yeah. So this is more about validity or accuracy. Because if you just ask about honeycomb, it could be that people, so there are 2 issues with that. It could be that just people's preference for any cereals increased, right? So, and because you asked about honeycomb, more people said yes. But if you asked about any other brand, you could have gotten the same results. So it had nothing to do with the advert game, or you could not tell if it was due because if they played the advert game or not. Secondly, People do cheat in surveys, and as we discussed. So yeah, like think of it. I'm making you watch an ad. And then I ask you later, would you like to order something from Taco Bell? You know that you know that the researcher is trying to test preference for Taco Bell. So you just answer yes, or like most people just answer yes, because yeah, you sort of like hinted to the participant what's the expected answer is, right? But if you made it like yeah, among other options, you actually would see if the preference increased for this specific product in comparison to other products, and without hinting that this is the product that the researcher are interested in, right? Hence, you see, the first question was open-ended, and then the second question was actually one option among others. So, so that's the point is like with self-reports, you want to be careful about these things. So, like to increase the validity of the answers, you want to avoid falling into the shortcoming of self-reported surveys we discussed last time. So misrepresentation, misremembering, and all of those things, right? So being careful about the wording is critical. Then we have also something we call the observer assessment. And so I ask participants, so the observer here is not the researcher, it's like the participant themselves, and they would rate a third object or a third person. And so classic example, I'll make you watch a movie, and then I ask you to rate the movie. I'm not rating the movie myself. You're not rating yourself as participant. You'd be rating a third object, right? Measure the perceived attractiveness, like for example, of the characters that you're playing, right? Or like to what extent they enjoyed the movie, right? So that's especially with person, it's like the perceived characteristics of that person, and be aware that it's about the perceived, right? It could be conducted about something like related to like personal or interpersonal communication. Um, if you're interested, for example, in online dating, you can, for instance, like ask participant to rate like the last 3 people they've met through, let's say, Bumble or Tinder, things like that, right? So the rating is going to be not by those people being rated, but by someone else. To be aware that how someone else perceived that person, right? Or it could be from mediated materials such as movies or videos, etc., right? This is mostly used when you're trying to study. So this is not about direct behavior, and it's not about like attitudes, but it's about people's perception. And I'll give you an example. So this is from a research I conducted myself with some of my co-authors. And so we wanted to see how people perceive, or it's perceived, right? The narcissism level of people on Instagram or Instagram profiles, different Instagram profiles. Specifically, we wanted to compare if like selfies in comparison to non-selfies affect the perception of the narcissism level of the Instagram. To put it more simply, so the profiles with selfies would be perceived as more narcissistic than profiles with no selfies, or like with like just normal third person images. The question is, regardless of the hypothesis, so how did we measure narcissism or perceived narcissism, to be more specific? So here, those are like, so we did not invent that. So we had this scale, and we did not invent it. We just borrowed it from like a scholarly article that's been established and already standardized. And it's like the perceived narcissism. It's like from the narcissistic personality inventory. So the questions were like, could be a he or she, depending on the profile. She likes to be, so I think this person to be like, she likes to be the center of attention. She likes to show off her body. She probably likes to also look at herself in the mirror. She thinks she is so special, etc., etc. Right? My question to you is, why didn't we simply ask the participants, do you perceive this person to be a narcissist or not? Why did we instead ask those like 4 or 5 different questions? What's the point of doing that? Yes, Emily.
I feel like there's this negative stigma associated with the word narcissism. So people might feel bad about looking at someone on Instagram being like, oh, yeah, they're a narcissist.
Right. So yeah, that's the one. So we have like type of like social sensibility. Yeah, I show you images of someone you don't even know. Okay, do you think that person is a narcissist, or is that person horrible? And that would be applied to if it was self-report, right? So when you fell the narcissism scale, yeah, no one would ask you, are you a narcissist? Unless they're bad at research. They would ask you different question, and then they would assess narcissism. So, but why we do that then? So that's one part. But why, if it wasn't about narcissism, even if it was something like socially desirable, like let's say extroversion or sociability, why do we have like multi-item scale for those instead of just asking, are you an extroverted or are you an introvert? Why do we come up with questions like that? You want a hint, it's related to last week's content, if you remember it.
Maybe because narcissists, like just asking if this person is a narcissist can have kind of like a more broad meaning or a really negative connotation. Whereas if you ask more specific questions, it can be easier to answer.
What do you mean by broad meaning?
Like it's kind of just like a big generalization about someone's personality as opposed to asking something more simple like, oh, they look at themselves too often in the mirror.
Mm-hmm. And so that, okay, Evelyn, and then everybody, what do we call that thing when we take just a broad or an abstract concept and then we specify what it is? What did we call that? Anybody? Last week? Well, first of all, Evelyn, your answer is right, because narcissism is a very broad concept. It could mean different things to different people. So we needed to ask more concrete items to measure it. That's absolutely correct. What do we call that? What do you call this process? Someone again. We call it operationalization. That's the thing. Right. So this is what operationalization looks like. So yeah, because narcissism could mean something to Evelyn and something else to Emily, a third thing to me. And so if you ask people how narcissistic you think this person is, the three of us could be thinking about 3 different concepts and we would answer accordingly, which means you cannot then compare our results because each one of us is talking about something totally different. Hence, we said you need to have an established and standardized scale that looks like this one here in the sheet. So yeah, whenever people answer regarding of like how personally you think what should be considered as narcissism, but those concrete standardized items, like no matter how you answer to them, that's going to be considered the measurement of perceived narcissism, right? That's why we need the standardization in quantitative research. So I hope you got the idea. You get the idea now, like why operationalization and standardization we've been talking about, right? So we define broad concepts like narcissism or extroversion or preference, etc., into concrete questions, and the average of like answers to those concrete questions will be considered the measurement of the original or intended concept we have in mind. Finally, and this is the last thing, also we need to be aware of like when researchers are measuring variables, think about if they are state variables or trait variables. So state versus trait. So state variables are temporary, trait variables are more stable. So a state is like a state of mind or a state of emotions. You're measuring someone's reaction or simulation at one point in time, a particular point of time. So you show like the one about advert games. You make children play a game and you ask about, did they pay attention to the brand that was being advertised? Or like you make people watch a movie and then you ask about excitement or fear or simulation or or intention to participate. So at one point of time, you want to see how they reacted to some material or stimuli. This is more common in experimental research, and which we're going to discuss at the end of this semester. So because it includes the induction, you induce one stimuli, and then you measure the reaction. As opposed to trait variables, so trait variables measure personality traits, basically. So you being narcissistic, extroverted, openness to experience, that's the one. That's another one. There's the one about like need to belong. That's another scale, right? So it's about things you have like as part of your personality, things that are stable, that characterizes who you are, your belief, your values, etc. Things like aggressiveness, passiveness. Those things are more stable. So basically, if I ask you about your traits on Wednesday, it should not be different than when I ask you on Sunday, then maybe on Tuesday, because that's a more stable thing, right? It's like a trait. And so, yeah, whenever you see those, make sure, for instance, that fear leads to more aggressiveness. Are they measuring temporary fear, like I make you feel something, then I ask you, or are they measuring fear as sort of like a trait, like people who are more fearful are more aggressive, right? So when you look at the accuracy of research being reported, this is like one of the things that we examine. So that's it for today. Do you have any questions? Okay, so I've been promising you. So I'm going to upload 2 videos, one about the group project, and then we have also like a very short, like 10 minutes exercise that will also talk about validity and accuracy. So yeah, I hope you can fill them at least by the end of this week. If you have any other questions, please let me know by emails or communicate. Take care, everybody.